Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Cook. I'm the online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you for today's webinar entitled From Models to Stories, Building Your Agile Backlog. Today's featured speaker is Beatty, Vice President of Seilevel. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer period at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature of the GoToWebinar software. I'd like to say thank you to 2080 Strategy Execution for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I will turn it over to Whitney Begg from 2080 Strategy Execution to say a few words before we get started.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, everyone. My name is Whitney Begg, today's webinar sponsor. And before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment and tell you about our organization. We are 2080 Strategy Execution, which is formerly ESI International and IPS Learning, if you're familiar with either of those brands. We are a performance education company focused on the alignment between strategy and project execution. We can help you develop and grow professionally in areas like contract management, business analysis, portfolio program project execution, strategy execution, agile, leadership, strategy execution, which I just mentioned. We offer a variety of courses specifically created for business analysts and project managers like you that focus on both technical and relational skills. Please visit our website for more information, www.strategyx.com. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy the webinar, and feel free to contact us for additional information. I will turn it over to you now, Joy.
Thanks, Whitney, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm looking forward to the session, and certainly looking forward to helping with any of the questions that might come up throughout that you want to ask. So, like Tracy said, pop them into the question box. I'll, for the most part, handle them at the end, but if one catches my eye in the moment, I'll try and answer it. So this is a quick look at the agenda for what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start at the top with, why do we even care about using models in Agile? What does that mean? Why is that important? And then we're going to get into some really good tactical stuff, like how do I use models to help me find features or epics? How do I use them to find user stories? Right? Once I have a good backlog of user stories, then I could think about how do I use models to elaborate those stories even further. And at the end, I'm going to leave you with a couple key takeaways that you can take back to your projects, hopefully immediately. So with that, let's dive right in. This is Blue. Blue comes to all of my presentations with me. I love to tell stories about different projects that I've worked on. I just like to anonymize them. And so Blue is, in this case, our business analyst. He is actually now working as a product owner on an Agile project. The project that he's working on is called C Sounds. It's a subscription-based music listening app, right? So you can think of something that's just going to stream music maybe through your phone. It's an app to manage that. And it turns out that Blue's organization has been losing money over the last 2 quarters. So Blue has a really strong set of analysis skills and requirement skills because he's been a BA for a long time. But acting in his new role of product owner on this Agile project, he's focused on really just writing user stories, just filling up that backlog. So as he gets into his project, he gets that backlog put together, he realizes he's not really sure that he's captured all of the stories that he needs. You know, he thinks he might be missing some stories. He's not really sure. The developers ask questions, and that might prompt him to go find them. But he doesn't feel very systematic, is I guess a good word for it, about does he have all those stories. The other thing that's interesting is he's gone and filled up this backlog, but it's still really difficult to prioritize every single thing in there to figure out which of them are going to help him achieve that true business value, right? So as we go through this webinar today, those kinds of things that Blue's facing are kind of a summary of the kinds of problems that I'm seeing as we take on more and more Agile projects. And so we're going to help give you guys and Blue some techniques to work through those kinds of scenarios. So what goes wrong when we move to Agile? Well, I've seen a collection of issues from kind of customer to customer, and some of the big ones that jump out at me, first of all, is that management is not bought into the Agile approach. Interestingly, I most commonly see that kind of that middle layer of management is not bought in. You might have executives who are mandating Agile or just generally on board with getting faster to market things. You have the individual practitioners like the business analysts, the testers, the developers, who are very excited about it. Excuse me, you guys, I do have a little bit of an allergy thing going on, so I apologize for the coughing. Anyway, so what we see is that middle road isn't maybe bought in, and that might mean that they're not trained on it, or maybe they don't see the value in the Agile approach, which makes life harder for those of us executing on the projects. Most commonly when I see it, it's something like you have an organization that's insisting that we have to do waterfall funding, and it doesn't really align with how Agile delivers. Or maybe it's where they still want to have an approval life cycle, and that doesn't really fit with Agile, where there's like this formal sign-off on a whole body of requirements or something like that. So that's one of the biggest problems I see. The other common thing I see, and I think this relates really specifically to what we're going to get in today, is that organizations will often have really strong practices around doing analysis work. And when they move to Agile, they drop the good habits that they had. Right? So they had good techniques, good skills around writing requirements. They used tools to manage that information. They did traceability, right? They used the visual models. But literally, they moved to Agile and they just stopped doing them. It's the weirdest thing to me. I saw it in my own organization where at Seilevel, it's really about models. I'm passionate about it. I think visualizing our requirements is so important to help us make sure that we have them all and that we can cut ones that we don't need. And even though like we've been doing this for a long time, when we started to do more Agile projects, I was stunned by our own people who lived and breathed this stuff every day were actually not doing it anymore. So it was a very strange effect. I didn't expect it, but that's okay. It's all stuff that we can all work together to fix. So I think of this whole Agile thing as a bit of a pendulum, and sometimes that pendulum maybe swings too far when they go Agile. I know that there's some organizations, they want to get away from doing any documentation, so they go to the opposite extreme, and it ends up, it's just not enough to deliver that value that's needed. So one of the key takeaways here for this audience is that going Agile doesn't really mean you don't have to do analysis, okay? And I'm hoping by nature of the fact you are here that the bulk of you actually believe that. And I'm going to hopefully give you some techniques that you can go and use so you can still do good analysis in the Agile environment. And keep in mind on Agile projects, you need just enough documentation. So that brings out the question of what is enough, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go into this presentation. One of the kind of tidbits I'll drop now for you as a hint to think about, though, is when you're doing your documentation, think about, have I done enough documentation that I have reduced the risk so the team can move forward and not have a lot of waste or a lot of rework on whatever that little increment that is they're working on? And maybe it's by looking at where the high complexity areas in the system, have I done enough on those, right? So when I talk about doing models, I'm not saying you have to do this on everything, but try and find those areas, high risk, high complexity, and do a bit more there maybe. All right, so again, kind of a common phrase you hear with Agile is that the measure of success is working software, not comprehensive documentation. So again, we're not trying to get to this full set, hundreds and hundreds of pages of models. That's not what I'm saying. That said, I am saying you do need to use them in some places. So many of the techniques that we use in models can apply in Agile, and the reasons we do them are actually all very much still the same. So for example, models are going to help us prioritize based on value. And by the way, I think this is even more important in Agile than anywhere else because you're trying to kind of rapidly, on the fly, reprioritize as you go. There's models like the business objectives model. There's one called objective chains that help us not only determine if something's a high priority or a low priority, but it'll actually help us stack rank features or user stories against one another, so we always know what is the next most important thing to develop. All right. The next thing I'll say is that models help us see that big picture. So they organize a lot of information. They help people get up to speed really quickly and give them some context to a collection of details. I was talking to one of our guys yesterday about his project that they did a bunch of user stories, and they have really more technical stories than anything, so pretty low-level details. There's a lot of data mapping and integration going on. Well, what they were finding is that people who were in charge of, they had some system end-to-end testers as well, and that group of people was really struggling because they didn't have the context. They only knew the one little nugget that they were trying to test to see if it worked in the big picture without understanding the big picture. And so the team went back and basically pulled together some just models like process flows and things like that to paint the picture from people that are kind of in the weeds day to day to get that big picture and get some context. All right, models also help us check to see if we've missed anything. So things like traceability, right, from our past help you find gaps in requirements, maybe help you find requirements that you don't actually need. But the key is that traceability, it's not a word that I like because I think it has a negative connotation for a lot of people. It sounds like a lot of work, but it's really, really valuable work. So call it what you want, but the point is we're going to link those stories back to how they add value. And then we're going to link within our models between one another to see if we can find any gaps in our information. We'll go through some examples of that here. All right, models help us collaborate with customers to deliver whatever's needed, right? So that's things like we can review models with them. Think of reviewing pictures with people. Pictures are easy, words are hard, right? So I can review these models with them, and that's a lot better than sitting down with them reviewing just pages and pages of text. Their eyes will gloss over, they're not taking it in, they're not recalling what they read, and so this will help you focus in on a particular subset of requirements, right? Maybe as you're going into a sprint, it's like narrowing it down based on what the model's helping you do to slice and dice it. And then that last one is they really help us simplify communication between the product owner and the development team, right? So we can supplement our requirements models to help just get the team on the same page about exactly what needs to be built or not to be built. So, all right, what I'd like to do here before I dive into the models themselves, I'm going to ask you guys to maybe in the question box, tell me right now how many of you are in Agile or Waterfall or both. Let me get a feel for the audience, and I'll share with you kind of the answers that come in. The other thing is, what models are you using today, right? What's working for you that you love? What are some of your go-to ones? All right, so great, thank you guys. So totally mixed here. We have some people who are strictly Waterfall, Agile, and both. I would say it's almost completely split between those evenly. We call ourselves Agile, but we really do a mix. More Agile than Waterfall. Hybrid, right? Both. Okay, great. So activity diagrams, I'm seeing some models coming in, state change, process flows. Excellent. Okay, good. So we have some good modeling skills on the phone. That's fantastic. There's a question here, what is hybrid in this new world? That could be a topic we could talk about for an hour in and of itself. I will tell you, I will tell you philosophically for myself that when I hear like large enterprises are moving to Agile, I am really careful about making sure that we're not trying to be very, very strict and formal and things that don't need to be. We're working with one Fortune 100 company, so it's a large company that is trying to transform the entire organization to Agile, and what they did was they picked one key pilot project. It's big, there's a lot of stakeholders involved in it, and are moving that, but the problem is they're integrating to other organizations or other projects in the organization that are still waterfall, and so they're having to come up with a hybrid that's kind of unique, right? They've got to do enough definition so these other teams can plan ahead, but they also don't want to pick every single feature, up front. So there's some cool things you can do to be flexible with that. I think that's the key word, is to be flexible. All right, other answers that came in here, like some people are not doing, sorry, I'm clicking on the wrong window. I'm trying to read the questions. Some people aren't doing any modeling at all, so that's great. We're going to learn some models today that'll help you get started. So thank you guys, good answers. All right, let's move into our first model. All right, so I mentioned something around business objectives, and there's a business objectives model that I absolutely love. I use it on every project. I'm going to give you a glimpse of some of the components of it today. It is something that I don't think I can get into a lot of detail here, but if you have questions, please put them in the box and I'll try and answer them about this particular model, because really powerful model, and at the end I'll point you to resources on where you can read more. But the essence of this model is we have a business problem and we have a business objective, okay? So a business problem is anything that it's really truly what it is. It sounds like any problem the business thinks they need to solve, right? It could be my customer satisfaction is bad, my revenue is dropping, I'm losing customers. It could be, you know, I have some compliance requirements that come out next year and I can't meet them with my current systems, right? And then we have objectives on the other side. And objectives are any kind of a measurement that says, how do I know if I solved my problem, right? What's the goal? And the key is it needs to be a measurable goal, all right? So at the highest level, we have both these problems and objectives that tell us why we're building the thing that we're building, right? And I have some arrows on the screen because it's a very iterative process. Again, it's a complicated model to just explain briefly, but the idea is if you can even explore what are the problems I'm solving in the objectives, you're doing a great job. Start there and understand those pieces, okay? So let me show you a quick example here from the C-Sounds project. The business problem, remember Baloo's project, C-Sound. So C-Sound subscription revenue has dropped 10% in the last quarter. All right, and notice this is great because this is a problem that's about something financial, so it's at the very highest level of the company that we care about solving this, and it's measurable. We know how big the problem is, so 10% in the last quarter. And then I might write a similar objective related to it, but how am I going to fix this problem? What does it look like if I solve the problem? Well, our objective is going to be to increase quarterly subscription revenue from $72,000 to $80,000 within 2 quarters from the beginning, from whenever development starts. And keep in mind, this is going to be an Agile project, right? So we're going to start rolling out functionality right away, right? So we're looking for a small increase just over the next 2 quarters that tells us we're on track to increase probably, hopefully, revenue longer term. All right. So again, this is super powerful model for us, and I think the essence of why I want to share this with you is that everything in your backlog needs to map back to solving this, to achieving this objective, all right? So imagine I have a backlog that has, let's just say, 100 different user stories in it. 100% of those stories have to map back and help me achieve that business objective, and if they don't, they should get cut or they should get prioritized to the very bottom of the list, okay? So what we can do, it's kind of interesting, is you can actually start to think about at a user story level, how much does an individual user story help me achieve this business objective? And the ones that help you achieve it more are the ones that you should prioritize for earlier iterations or sprints, right, for development. All right, let's jump into what is probably one of my very favorite models. All of our business objectives that we outline will help us figure out which features we should be building or not. All right, this model that I'm going to show you is called a feature tree. Now, first of all, let me back up and tell you, when I say feature, think of that as a short form description of some area of functionality in the solution. Again, that feature ultimately is going to help us meet the business objectives. Okay, so features are collections of requirements or collections of stories. You can actually have different levels of features, so you'll see that here. There's an L1, an L2, and an L3 feature. Right, L1 is the highest level, L2 is a sub-feature to that, and an L3 is below that. All right, so at any given level, if I have an L1 feature, I might have 10 different user stories that describe that feature, but down at the L3 level, it could be more like a one-to-one mapping. So feature models or feature trees are really used to help us organize large amounts of features to see what's in scope for our project. The thing I like about this model is I can show a lot of features in a one-page view, literally fit on one physical page. So it's kind of like a summary view of all the functionality that I'm going to deliver in the system. For that reason, I will tell you that any executives who are looking for documentation about your project will actually quite like this model because what it's summarizing for them what they're going to get. It's basically putting the solution on one page. Remember, though, all your business objectives that we just talked about a minute ago have to map directly to the features, or really your features have to map back to those business objectives, right? If the feature doesn't actually add value, then we don't want to build it. And the ones that add the most value should be the ones we build first, right? So if we were looking for something like a $1 million return on a project, and we have some features that are worth about $100,000 in value, and others that are worth $10,000 in value, well, which one are we going to build first? Very clearly, we should build the $100,000 features first. So let's look at the example from C-Sounds. That line through the middle, that's kind of the branch of our tree. We call that the product concept. That's the solution, the thing that we're building, right? And so in this case, it's C-Sounds. And then at the top, I've got the custom radio player. Let me give a little bit more background because I know I just introduced Blue's company to you briefly, but in the subscription model here, a couple things. Listeners can listen to music for free if they listen to ads. There's also, they found a strong correlation between the customer's listening time and upgrading to a paid subscription. So the more they listen, the faster they subscribe because they get tired of the repeating ads. All right, so ultimately the goal for Blue to get more subscription revenue, he's got to get people to listen longer, okay? So he's making the connection from the objective down to something he can work with and build against or prioritize against, okay? So thinking about Blue's business objective, right, what features might we build? Well, a couple things here. Blue thinks that if he could allow customers to create a custom radio player, then they might be willing to listen longer because then they can hear new songs that are similar to ones that they already like. So that's our first top-level feature, is a custom radio player. Blue also thinks if customers could see what their friends are listening to, they would be willing to listen to more of what their friends are listening to because maybe they like, sorry, there's the detail. They would maybe like similar things that their friends like, okay? So that's a quick view of what the and this is clearly only a subset of the overall feature tree, but these are two top-level features, custom radio player and social activity feed. And then you'll see some L2 things underneath that, right? So we're basically just breaking down what's a custom radio player mean. Well, it's things like I can create a station, I can rate my songs, I can modify a station, and so on. Now, after investigating these two features, Blue figures out that custom radio players tend to increase listening time by 25%, and the social media integration, the bottom feature down there, will increase listening time more like 7%. So, knowing that his goal is to increase listening time so that he can increase subscription revenue, Blue's going to decide the obvious thing here, which is to build out that custom radio player first in the first release, okay? So, it's not to say that the second one, things like rating songs or modifying stations, and those again are in the L2s there, they're nice features, right? It's not to say he shouldn't do them, but the key is that Blue's going to invest the minimum possible time to determine how can he start to move the dial on subscription revenue, right? So it's not to say he won't do those. I want to be clear about that, and that's why I think where a lot of our business stakeholders freak out is if we don't build it, we don't say we're going to build it right away, are we ever going to build it? Okay, so this is where Blue can start to prioritize things. So in this particular case, he can actually use this model and highlight on it, what is he going to do in release 1? And he might say, hey, I'm going to do, this create station 1. And then he could add additional colors and additional coding to show future releases. Or you can call them sprints. You could do it at that level, whatever works for your methodology. Okay. One of the things I think is we've identified all these features. I want to make that connection a little bit to thinking about epics and user stories, right? So once I have those features, those aren't written like stories. That's not traditional Agile, right? I put air quotes around that, but nobody could see it. Those features will actually help us figure out what are the top-level epics, and then they'll help us feed into our stories, okay? So going through that model is great to organize our thoughts and prioritize, but also to help us jump into creating kind of the stuff that's going to go in the backlog. All right, so we're going to use them to find our epics, particularly that top level or the second level. The L1 and L2 features can help us get into our epics. So if you haven't heard the terminology before, an epic, by definition, is something that cannot get built in one iteration. Okay, so they need to get broken down further. So here's two examples from our create station feature. Right, one of them is about finding artists similar to the ones you like, and one is about finding suggestions that are similar to songs that you like. Okay, so again, those are complex enough that they cannot be built in one iteration. And this format up here is just one standard format to write these in. In our feature model, remember that we had different levels of features. Your project, it may look a little different, so don't be surprised by that. But for some projects, you may have L3 or L4 features. So getting into those lower level features, you may find that those are still at the epic level, and that's okay. You're not doing anything wrong. It's all relative to based on the project and what a feature is, right? How complex it is, what level of detail you're going into. There's no right or wrong answer, so I'm trying to get at. Okay, either way, even epics like these, are going to get broken down into more stories, okay? And we'll get to that in just a minute here. One reference point for people who are familiar with Agile and use a thing called story points, right? There's kind of an industry average that people use, which is that 21 points or larger is considered an epic, right? Then it needs to get broken down. So if you're not familiar with that concept, maybe jot it down and we can talk about it later, but story points are one method to kind of figure out, am I at the right size or not? All right, so here we go. Let's talk about user stories for a minute. All right, so requirements in an Agile project are typically written in the user story format. Now, a kind of a common reminder for writing good stories is what they call the 3 C's, and they're bolded here on the screen. Right, the card, so the story needs to be small enough it could fit on one side of a card, and I will say it right now that I don't ever do this on actual physical cards. I'm a big fan of using tools to help you support this, particularly with global teams. I know that's not ideal, but it happens. But anybody who's ever worked with a card stuck on the wall, eventually they're going to fall off the wall is what I found. So the spirit of it, though, is that the stories are short, concise things that could fit in about the size of a card. The second C is conversation. So that's a story that's just a promise that the story, lose my word there. A story is really just a promise to have a conversation. Okay, so it's not that I'm going to put every single nitty-gritty detail on here. It's to say we're going to talk about this more. We're going to flesh it out a bit more. It's a placeholder to get some idea of what's coming. And then the confirmation. This is really about the acceptance criteria that you would define as you go into more detail to say that the story was built or not successfully. All right, now, what I have seen is that in some organizations that are transitioning to Agile, we have to be careful. Sometimes those user stories have become the requirements, and it's the only way to requirement, and that isn't true. We know that from our analysis skills. There's different ways to handle requirements, different levels of depth, different things you need. So we're going to talk more about how we can supplement user stories with models, of course. I just want to be clear, I'm never going to tell you that user stories are the one and only way to write requirements. And if you're hearing that, that's a big red flag, because user stories are good but not sufficient. They don't tell us the whole picture. All right. So let's look at another model here real quickly, and the process flow. So this is another model that we use on almost every single project. We've identified epics, from our features. We've talked about stories, but how do we find those stories? Well, process flows are actually a really good tool for this. You can actually start at the top with your epics and break them down into chunks that can be delivered, and process flows will help you do that slicing and dicing to the right sizes of stories. All right, the one thing I'll tell you about process flows is business stakeholders absolutely love them. So I encourage you to use them and use them and use them, because it's a model that they can look at and read and understand, and it will not scare them. Right? If they're having a hard time adapting to writing user stories or understanding user stories and working with you on that, start with process flows. Ease them into it that way. So in our scenario, Blue determined that creating stations based off of artists rather than individual songs would produce more suggestions. So that would keep customers likely listening longer, with more new songs than playlists that are created off of one single song. So for that reason, we took that first epic and we created the process flow that goes with it, and that's what you see here on the screen right now. So this is for a user creating a playlist by selecting artists rather than songs, okay? So it's just step by step, pretty trivial to read, right? We select a new station, we search for an artist name, we select the artist, we add more artists, either yes or no. If no, we can either name our station, maybe save our station, and then play our station, okay? And again, this is all related back to I get them to listen more so that they eventually will subscribe. Now, once you have this process flow, now you have a way to systematically look for user stories. Every single step in that process flow, you can look at and say, are there any stories that I need to write that would support doing this, right? And it may be multiple stories. That's okay, but here's one example of search for artist name was the step. Well, let's story for that. Right? And so it's as a C Sounds listener, I want to be able to search for artists to create my station from so that I can quickly find the artist I like. All right, here's another example. Here's another step in our process flow. And you'll see this one has two stories. One of those is actually a technical story, right? So this is in order to allow listeners to create stations from their favorite artists. Listeners need suggestion logic to load stations with music similar to the select artist music. So what this is a signal that we need to do some interesting logic behind the scenes. The user themselves isn't interacting with, but would certainly receive the benefit of. Okay, and then I have one more example for you here. This is another step in that same process flow, and yet another user story came out of it. But what I've done here is said, okay, we were at that epic level. It's not to say that you couldn't get from epic down to these stories. You probably would come up with some of them. But by going the process flow way and breaking out what are the steps in my process, I'm giving you a way to think about each step uniquely, which will help you miss fewer user stories, is how I would put it. Okay? Here's some guidelines too that we found kind of work. Each L1 step, each step in the process flow is probably at least one epic in your top level process flow, but at that L2 level, which is what I just showed you, then you might start to see about a 1-to-1 ratio of step to story. And again, it's about 1-to-1. You may have 2, you may have 4, you may have 0. All of those are okay options. I'm just trying to get you into the right ballpark. Okay. If you do a process flow with swim lanes, and my process flow did not show swim lanes, but that's where you might have, you know, some of the steps are done by one person and some of the other steps are done by another person. The handoff between some swim lanes might be a place that you can look for epics or user stories potentially, or technical stories even. Right. Decisions in your process flow are likely to be one or more stories. Maybe a branch is its own story, for example. If I take one path, that's one story. If I take the other path, that's a different story. Okay? And each process might map to one or more stories and acceptance criteria, clearly. All right, now we're going to get into state models. So state tables and state diagrams are the two state models. Are kind of our go-to answer for those. The state table is the upper left model here. The state diagram is the one in the middle of the screen. All right. State models are to help me see the transition of the state of any object in your system, right? They capture, think of it like a piece of data. It's capturing the life cycle of that data through your system, right? They capture the events that cause the changes in the state of the data. So we use them really anytime we have any kind of object or data that has some kind of complex state changes to it, because they help us find the missing state changes. Right, and I put both of these models up here. They are actually used in slightly different ways, but they complement each other nicely. So a state table is when I want to make sure I've considered every possible state and every possible transition. That state table helps me make sure I don't miss any transitions, because I can check every single box in that table and say, can I move from the state on the left to the state at the top? Right? Can I move from state A to state D? Yes. There's a transition event that does that. Can I move from A to E? No. So as I'm filling in that table, it's adding some rigor to what I'm doing. But the state diagram is nice. First of all, easier for a lot of people to read, to understand what's going on. It helps me visualize only the transitions that are actually valid, so I can see what's going on, what's that flow of information through how they move through their life cycle. So again, let's look at an example. I think that helps these. And this is from C-Sounds. I have 3 states. This is just part of what a state diagram might look like. Usually they're a bit more complicated than this, but in this particular case, I've got 3 different states. When I first create my station, I'm going to be in that private state down there at the bottom. And from there, you can kind of follow the arrows off to the left. If the listener deletes the station from their profile, the state of my station moves to deleted. That's an end state. Once I've deleted it, it's gone forever. However, when I start, I'm in that private state. If I choose to share my station on social media with my friends, it is now a public station, okay? And again, if it's public, I can delete it. And if it's public, I can choose to take it off of social media and make it private again, right? So I'm talking about the state of the station itself. Is it private or is it public? And how do I move between those, right? And there's only 3 states here. This one is pretty simple, but you can imagine if I had 5 or 6 that this thing is going to get a lot messier. And it's hard to figure out, have I considered all the different possible paths through this without putting them in that table I showed you on the other screen. Now, interestingly, each transition in your state diagram is probably a user story, okay? So again, this is just a small piece of it, But let's look at this here again. So we have that listener chooses to share that station on social media. That's a user story, and I've written that story up here on the left top of the screen for you. All right, so this is thinking about all the different transitions. Are any of those stories? And my point is that they usually are. Okay. The other one down here, so if they want to take it off social media, so the user story there is, as a C-Sounds listener, I want to designate a previously public station as private so that my social media connections will not be able to interact with that station. Pretty straightforward, right? And again, you might have come up with that story on your own, but you might not have, right? There's a reasonably good chance you will not come up with all of them if you don't use some kind of approach like this to find the tricky ones in there. All right, once you have stories identified, mock-ups are really nice to help you elaborate those stories. All right, so our designers, developers that we work with, they love this. It gives them a feel for what the product owners are asking for. Business stakeholders love it because they can see. They like to see pictures of what it's going to be. Now, one caution about mock-ups is we have to be sure that our implementation team doesn't treat them as it has to look like this unless it actually has to look like this, right? But usually we're using a low fidelity mock-up because it's fast. We can be quick to iterate, and we don't argue over colors, we don't argue over fonts. We're really focused on what are the things on the screen, maybe some general layout about what they might look like. And I think, you may be in a situation where you have real screen shots that you could use, like true picture true. You can use those. You just need to be careful about setting expectations about what's fair game to talk about or not talk about in the conversations. By the way, this particular one is made in a tool called Balsamic. There's lots of tools out there. We like that one particularly, but really fast to put together. You just kind of pull in buttons and menu options and things like that, and then you can export them to PDFs for people who don't actually have the tool themselves, right? So you can use any tool and then export the image. All right, and there's a couple, here's an example of what you can do with it if you notice I'm clicking through just to show how you can create variations of the mock-ups, almost simulating the real life. And I know there's other tools out there that do that in a fancy way. All right, so let me keep going here. We've talked quite a bit about finding user stories. I want to talk a little bit more about the elaboration of those user stories. So mock-ups are good because they put the visual to it. But as you get into elaboration, you're going to create what we call acceptance criteria, okay? And let me show you an example of one here. This is a common construct for them, a given, when, then statement to write an acceptance criteria, okay? I'm showing you text here. I want to keep in mind that words alone are usually not enough, right? So we're going to write our acceptance criteria, but we're also going to supplement that text with the things like the mock-ups or additional visual models that can be key, just depending on the thing you're writing about, that might help illustrate to the people developing it or testing it, what it needs to do. Now, one of the things that you'll find is, at least I've seen in a lot of organizations, get the acceptance criteria in and I'm done. Just be careful because done may not actually be done enough. So that whole definition of done, my caution to you is make sure that you guys are defining one that truly works. Is it truly sufficient to move forward? The other thing about this, as you put them into the backlog and you elaborate them, do just enough. Don't go into too much detail on these. So I'm going to show you how you can use a couple of decision models to supplement these just as an example. And you will notice you would not do this for every one of these criteria. You would do it for the ones where you need to do it. So as I elaborate my story with acceptance criteria, like I said, I can use models to do that, to figure out what are those additional details that people might need, or I might need to find additional acceptance criteria, right? So decision models help me, that's one model that we can use that help me figure out what are all the possible acceptance scenarios. Okay, so they model the classic if-then statements, right? That kind of logic in our systems. These are great tools to get through to do that. Okay, so if you have any kind of complex logic, let me just jump right to the example. This is, again, from C-Sounds. This is the kind of logic we're drilling down into. If you remember in our process flow, there was actually a decision around this to get more detail around that process of selecting additional artists for the station. Right, so you can think of this as kind of magnifying glass in on that decision from the process flow. And as I go through this and I model this, I might come up with some additional acceptance criteria. right, decision trees can be really good about things like error handling or exception cases. You know, here as an example, if I take this all the way through down to the bottom right, we can see that we haven't yet specified that after a user has selected 5 artists, they should be notified that 5 is the maximum number of artists for a single selection. All right, so this helps me see how the developer might have to think through that suggestion logic really carefully. There may be some additional layers of complexity depending on how many artists they select. So creating a suggested playlist based off of like 5 artists can be much more complex than creating one off of a single artist. Right? This should also prompt you to discuss with your stakeholder about whether maybe that warning about a maximum of 5 should actually begin sooner rather than later, right? But the point is that this model brought out that conversation. It brought out this particular criteria as well that we wouldn't necessarily have thought of had we just tried to write the user story and write the acceptance criteria on our own. Okay, we've got another quick look at a model. This is our last model, because I want to make sure we save some time for Q&A today. So business data diagrams, or BDDs for short, is another example of something that we can use to elaborate our stories. You may also know this as an ERD, an entity relationship diagram. Just as a side note, I call it business data diagram on purpose because I'm really focused on the business stakeholders' data, not on the database design. So you can think of it as logical design rather than physical design. I just know that I find if I go to my business stakeholders and say I want to talk about an ERD, they kind of freeze up and think that's technical. So it's a little bit of a name game going on that actually works. So business data diagrams really help us bound our system from a data perspective. And the point, again, isn't using this to design a database. It's to figure out what are the business rules in the system that I'm not already thinking about. They may help me actually find additional process flows or additional user stories as well. Because looking at these, I can look at, well, how is each of these pieces of data created? How is each one deleted in the system? Those may lead me to different user stories that talk about how do you create like a station or something like that, okay? So here is a quick example from our C Sounds project. You know, I'm going to read this to you because for people who have not actually worked with this particular model before, I think this is one of the hardest ones to pick up and learn it right away. But once you do it enough, you get in the habit of how you do it. So we can take things like we can see that a user up here at the upper left can have either 0 or up to n different stations, okay? So they can have no stations, or they can have more than one station. And the way this is designed, they could have as many stations as they want. All right, so you can see that's a business rule that I've just stated out loud to you. And you would create this, by the way, review it with your stakeholders, and they may say, oh no, that's not okay. They can either have 0 or 1, but they can never have more than 1. And then you would change that n to a 1. So other ways you can read this is a particular station can belong to one user or multiple. So here's one over here on the right. We have a song can have 1 or more artists. So every song has to have an artist, okay? And the funny thing, by the way, my old version of the slide, we had a typo in it. It said that you could only have 1 artist. But we all know you can have, you know, like a band singing is more than 1 artist. So the appropriate response here is to have 1 to n. So I could have more than 1 artist in a given song. So that's how you read this. So you kind of take the object and then you read the relationship on the far end of the line for the object that's down there. So really it's telling me about what are the relationships between the pieces of data, and then what's the nature of those relationships, right, the entity levels. So what's cool about this is I can use this to figure out things like, okay, I have acceptance criteria that I maybe didn't think of, or again, you might find, I'll show you an example here of user stories, but in this one, given that a listener has added an artist to a station, when the listener selects to play that station, then that station is populated by similar songs as defined by the selection logage. So again, it's just looking at these entity relationships, here's another one, to say, okay, what kind of criteria come out of that particular piece of the line between these data objects, okay? So the idea is I will write those criteria. I also want to encourage you, these models, you should hand them over to your implementation team. They should be looking at those too, because it may prompt them to think of something you didn't think of. When I said that these the BDD can help you find user stories, what I meant by that is I can think through how do I, for each of these data objects, how do I create them? How do I create a user in the system? How do I create a station? How do I create an artist? How do I create a song? And if I go through and ask that of every single one of them, I just cross off to say, do I have those user stories or not? If not, I create a user story. Like maybe I forgot the create song user story. And then I do the same for those other, I'm going to go back a slide, those other 6 verbs. Are any of the data pieces deleted? Can I delete a user from the system? Can I delete an artist? And maybe they're going to be like, no, we don't delete them, we archive them. But that's okay. Now you've gotten to the essence of what that story needs to be. Can I edit them? Can I use them? Can I move them? Or can I copy them? Those 6 actions are the only things that can ever happen to data in any system. So if you ask those 6 verbs about every single one of your data objects, you will actually uncover all of the different stories that you think you need to be thinking about. All right, question to the audience. What other models? Have I reminded you of some other model that you use that maybe you could use in Agile? And you can shoot a question over in the question box and let me know. I'm curious if I inspired them. Are there models that you're like, oh, I could totally use this? DAR model, okay, thank you. Love the DAR model. Decision Action Response is the name of a model. When I showed you the mock-up screen, you guys, there's a table that you can put with it that is called a DAR, a Display Action Response. And what it does is it tells me for all the elements on the screen, where an element could be a button or a selection box, how does that particular element display in different states of my system? And how does it behave, right? So maybe like take a log in, log off button. It says log in. Well, when the user logs off the system, that button now says log in or log off. If I'm logged in, it'll say log off. So when I log out, it's going to now say log in. So that button is the same button. It's just going to look different in different states. There's actually a model to help you think through all of that. Other things we've got: use cases, decision tables. Great. I went through decision tree. The decision table is actually a really powerful one as well, for similar purposes, really. Anyone else? We've got a couple others coming in, but use cases. Yeah, that's interesting. So use cases, question mark, David. And here's the thing that most organizations who are doing Agile are going to do user stories. Use cases used to be really popular. I see them kind of come and go. I think they're a powerful tool to help you get into that level of interaction between how this user is going to use the system. So it's a level of depth more than a user story is going to give you. So it's the same type of information, it's just more detail around it. So there's no reason you shouldn't be using them. Swim lanes, that's great. That's taking like a process flow and dividing up who's doing the different tasks. Action diagrams. Right, so Richard commented, use cases are good for highly interactive systems, decision models. Okay, good. All right, well, before we get into the Q&A real quickly, I promised some key takeaways. There's this great saying that I heard about a year ago and love it. I think that this sums up everything and everything about Agile projects, really. If you've seen one Agile project, you've seen one Agile project, right? So, and the use of models in Agile project is no different. It's just like this. The whole point is that every Agile project is different from every other Agile project. They're all going to be a little bit different. And I think that's actually true, by the way, of non-Agile projects for what it's worth. But, you know, when I talked at the beginning about what is enough documentation, well, it depends, because the answer for one project might not be the answer for a different project. You know, and on the experience of your team, it could depend on that. It could depend on the size of the project, how complex is the project, how risky is the project, how much business value does the project add, right? So the models that you use to identify the stories and the models you use to elaborate them are absolutely going to be situationally dependent. There's some tips and tricks we can use to help figure out what those models are, and but the point is that it's not like a black and white script. We've got to be able to think a bit to figure this out. Now, I can't stress it enough, right? The choice of models you use are going to be situational. But again, here are some suggestions. And if you want to grab this, we have a quick short PDF that summarizes for you if you think it's a useful tool to have like on your desk later to remind you of what models. You can grab that online. I think the key here is that, you know, if I'm trying to find features and epics, I want to be thinking about that business objectives model. What are the objectives? Why am I even doing this project before I try and start to name features? The feature tree we talked about, and then the process flow. There's two different levels here. That top level process flow will help me find the epics in my system. And then getting into how I find stories, well, that lower level process flow, getting more depth in my process steps will help me find stories. Remember, we can go step by step by step through my process flow to figure out what stories might come out of each and every step. State diagrams that we just showed, those, the transitions are a great place to look for stories. And then we have the ecosystem map. I didn't have time to go through that one today, but the gist of this model is that it shows you what are all the different systems in my kind of domain area, in my ecosystem, and how do they interact with one another? Which ones are linked to one another? Okay, so that's going to tell me where there's some interfaces between systems. And then I can look a little further and say, well, what data is getting passed between those systems and why? And is that maybe a user story, or maybe there's some technical stories behind those? And then the last section, right? We don't just stop there. We use our models to find our stories, but we also use our models to elaborate our stories, okay? All right, so we've got things like decision tables, decision trees, business data diagrams. There's a couple of ones that we went through there that help me add additional detail. So I can write all text out that says, here's my acceptance criteria, but it's better if I can use those models to help make sure I'm not missing acceptance criteria, and to maybe just give more context to the team that's implementing this, right, so that they know where this came from. Quick question from Kurt that just came in, I saw, is an ecosystem map the same as a context diagram? If you know the context diagram, then use that for the exact same purpose. They're actually slightly different models, but the main difference is a context diagram is going to look at, you know, your system will be in the middle of it, and it's everything that interfaces to it, and it could be people interfaces, it could be system interfaces, it could be physical stuff being passed around. That ecosystem map that I'm talking about looks at not just where is my system interacting with other systems, but where is my system maybe creating data that gets passed to a system, that gets passed to 3 more systems downstream. My ecosystem map would show all of that, because if I change a piece of data in my system, I want to know downstream who am I going to impact, or upstream, same thing. So the ecosystem map is like a context diagram, except for that it's only systems and it goes a little bit further in reach. So great question, Kurt. All right, before I jump into some of the other questions and answers, I want to take a quick moment to, again, thank you to Whitney, who joined us from 2080 Strategy Execution. And so some great, if you need particularly some skills training in there, I know that they've got some great content, so you can go check them out. And with that, I'm going to put our contact information up here, both for 2080 and for myself. I always welcome direct emails. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn. Welcome any kinds of questions. If I didn't get to your question today, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask me about it, because I love to help. Mind you, it is the holidays, so there may be a little bit of a delay, but I will do what I can as soon as I can. All right. With that, I'm going to sort of kind of jump around on the questions. So I won't get to them all. It looks like there's some really good questions here, but I'll see what I can do. All right. So how do you assess, I like this one, how do you assess when a more formal approach needs to be taken? And this was kind of earlier in the webinar that this question came in. And I think, you know, as I've just said, it depends, everyone's differently, but here's the key things that I look for adding formality rather than not adding it, because we don't want to over-formalize something, particularly in Agile where we're trying to be rapid, iterative. But if I have, I'm going to look at who's doing the implementation, right? Are we all co-located or are we distributed? Because the minute we are distributed, we need to be a little bit more formal, both in our process but in our documentation, in our analysis efforts, okay? I'm going to look for how familiar is the team with the domain or the solution that we're working on, right? If they've been working on it for 20 years, less detail, less formal. But if they're all new to it, we can't do that. If they are maybe speaking a different language than I am, that also is a reason I would want to be more rigorous in my documentation. People maybe where English isn't a first language, if I'm creating English user stories, they may understand them, but it will help them to have more visuals to support that. So they'll more likely understand the materials. That's the hope. But the other thing outside of that I'm going to look at is what are the most high priority and highest risk to go wrong areas of my application. This is actually a really interesting point that reminded me of. When I talk about how much detail to go into, what's enough, how formal to be, wherever you decide to go on one particular slice of your system, you do not actually have to be consistent. That is surprising to a lot of VAs because they think, oh, we've got to be the same level of consistency or details across it. You don't. You know, figure out, okay, I've got this one feature that is really high risk and complicated. I'm going to do so much more documentation on that, and I'm going to do a lot less over here on the log in, log out button because they already know how that works, okay? So be smart about where you're putting your efforts. There's no reason that you have to be consistent on that. Okay. So let's see. Okay. Edward is confirming with me. I agree. This detailed user stories are closer to use cases. That's fair. And by the way, if you ever look at the software requirements book, and actually I think all of its editions has these different levels of requirements, where at the top level you have business requirements, then you have user requirements, and you have functional requirements at the bottom. That middle level called user requirements, historically those were use cases most commonly, but today that's user stories. So they sit at the same level of the requirements hierarchy as user stories. They're just written in more depth is what I'll say. Okay, let's see here. I'm sorry, guys. I'm trying to skim the questions to find some interesting things. Okay, so I put up the feature tree, I think, and I got the question, is this something like a fishbone diagram for Lean Six Sigma? I want to clarify that. The template is the same. The feature model that I showed you, where I had the L1, L2, and 3 features, the line through the middle, we actually do use the fishbone diagram template to make that happen. And it's not at all like Six Sigma or any of those other processes do, like root cause analysis with that same diagram. Totally different thing. We're just using the same shape structure of it. So that's just because it was easier and visual, and we like the visual look of it. It actually looks really nice, but it's not used for cause and effect. You could do that, but that is not the intention of that model. It's really just to show what are the features and how do they group how do they organize together. As a quick side note, on our website we have all those as templates that you can download. They're Visio files, Excel files, some Word docs, things like that. So if that's useful to you, you can grab them or shoot me an email and I can point you to them. All right, so how is business value determined? Sue has a really big question there. Great question. It's one of the hardest things we do. And the biggest thing is to determine the business value. It's more than anything having conversations with the stakeholders who own it on the business side, not the IT side. And it's asking them, why do you want to build this? Why is this important? And you're going to keep asking why, until you start to get to some answers that relate to money. That's like the biggest thing, because projects are either about saving money or making money. And there's very little exception to that. Even projects that are for compliance reasons or to avoid fines or avoid losing customers or avoid going out of business, right? So I'm going to, if somebody says, why do I want to add a feature that increases listening time? Well, I'm doing it because I want to have my users stay on longer. Why? Well, because if they do that, they'll subscribe more. Well, why do you care about them subscribing more? And then, the answer is probably something like, well, that's how I make more money. And it sounds obvious. It's not that simple in our projects. But if you keep asking that why, that'll eventually get you to what the true business value is on your project. All right. Okay, this is a big one, how would you do something differently for large scale or government projects, modernization projects, things like that? Each one is going to be a little bit different on how I handle it, but I will tell you, I think one of the biggest questions is to figure out if you're having to integrate with projects that are not also Agile, then you need to do a little bit more depth on your requirements and your models earlier than you would normally do it in an Agile project. And that's for any large scale, whether it's government or not. When you're doing a modernization, if you have an existing system and you're bringing it up to speed, there's a model that I didn't go through today called a KPIM model. Sorry, it's KPI model. What that's doing is taking your processes, your business processes, and figuring out what are the performance metrics, the KPIs, that you have today on your existing system that you absolutely must maintain in the new system. right? So I had an insurance company who had a number of claims that they could process, and it was about figuring out how many, you know, like they had to go to the new system, but they had to be able to still process 100 per, you know, user every single day. That was our metric. We prioritized our backlog of stories on maintaining those specific metrics. So there's some cool things you can do with that. And Tracy, I'm looking at the clock here. I think we are about out of time, so I want to hand it back to you so you can kind of wrap things up. There's a ton of questions I didn't get to, guys, so shoot me an email. Please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you all.
Joy, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation today. Very fact-filled. As I said, we are wrapping up right now. It's the top of the hour. We'd like to thank everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides and the video, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.